Hey everybody, and welcome to week 11 and our final topic for the semester, Aboriginal Novels and Authors Part 3, focusing on Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence by Doris Pilkington. Where previously we discussed the film adaptation, of this novel, today we are talking about the book itself. Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence also marks our last week of content before going on to revision next week. Next week will be more staunchly theoretical, as all the topics and ideas we have previously discussed will be revised and tied together in a rather neat fashion. It is important to remember that while next week does not have a topic per se or new content per se, it will present a succinct form of preparation for your exam. But enough about next week. This week is on Doris Pilkington's novel, Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, and let's talk about that a bit. Perhaps one of the, most interesting features about Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, the book, and the Rabbit-Proof Fence, the film, is the manner in which collectively both have generated a variety of images attempting to summarize the work, its themes, and content. These images occur in two chief forms. Typically, the first is on the cover of a variety of books, and the second on the variety of film posters. Obviously, covers of the books for the book and film posters advertising the film. And I have three up here for us to discuss today. The first is the cover of the novel, depicting three figures, presumably Molly, Gracie, and Daisy, walking hand to hand in rags across a white desert landscape. The second is an Australian poster for the film, depicting three girls approaching a harrowing piece of fence that looks like it's been ripped straight from the set of Wolf Creek or some other horror film with a caption, 1,500 miles is a long way to go home. The last poster is a film poster that was designed to promote the film on its United States release. And this one shows a rough bush landscape and wide shot of a fence with the caption, "What would you do if the government kidnapped your daughter?" What I think each of these sort of images associated with Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence do, however, is highlight just how complicated and multifaceted the narrative of the novel is. As we'll talk about, the book has a great deal of history in it. So is the book a subaltern history of Western Australia? Is the book even about Molly, Gracie, and Daisy? Is the book about the stolen generation? Is it a book about Aboriginal survival and endurance? And I think the answer to each of those questions is yes. It's all of those and a variety of other things. Thus, it is evident in adapting the book to film that the process essentially eliminated the majority of the book's content. And indeed, like on reading the book, it's kind of striking in contrast to the film just how little of the book actually makes it into the film. And it's evident that in adapting, the majority of the book's content has been removed for the purposes of the film. And reflecting and contrasting the book with the film, it feels as though the long saga of colonisation and family connection that Doris Pilkington has laid out for her readers has been largely ignored or cut away in favour of focusing on chapters 6 through 8, less than half of the book, which can be crafted, I guess, into a narrative with a clearly defined series of protagonists, Molly, Daisy, and Gracie, along with a very clearly defined antagonist, A.O. Neville. And the plot, in this sense, of those three chapters, once you position that protagonist and antagonist dynamic over the narrative, becomes one that is easily discerned and followed. That is to say, the girls are taken away, they escape and return home. It has a return to paradise, it has trial, and it has a happy ending. And And indeed, it's difficult to read Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, especially in this unit where we previously looked at the movie, without drawing comparison to the film. And particularly in this unit, we opened up our second week, our first week of I guess, definitive content after the introduction, with Rabbit-Proof Fence, the film. And now we close our second last week with Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, the novel. And I think then the two major differences between the film and novel are firstly the time span covered by the novel. In comparison to the film, which is set staunchly within the 1930s, the novel begins in 1826 and concludes in the early 1930s. I think 1932, although if you count the sort of where are they now kind of chapter, it kind of indicates a time span up to 1940. Secondly, unlike the film, the book focuses firstly on the wider Indigenous population of Western Australia, and then in later chapters draws a focus staunchly on the three girls, Molly, Daisy and Gracie. While individuals such as Captain Sterling or A.O. Neville are prominent while figures such as A.O. Neville are prominent in the film, within the novel, A.O. Neville is one of a variety of historical figures such as Captain Sterling, who are featured very briefly and largely in the background. So, in that sense, the novel is very much a subaltern novelisation of the history of British colonisation. That is to say, it is an account of the development of the British colonial process within Western Australia from an Aboriginal perspective. Where the film is more explicitly a depiction of history and the recreation of the 1930s for the cinema screen, I felt a great deal of what drives Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence as a novel lies in recounting the subject matter, i.e. the history that is typically excluded from your, traditional history books and sources. And indeed, there is rather a lot of history in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, and one that deals broadly with the colonisation of Western Australia by the British Empire and the continuation of that colonial apparatus, along with its extension by the Australian government following Federation. And I guess stage one of that colonisation recounted by the book begins with Major Lockyer in 1826 at King George Sound. And what is interesting, I think, as a subaltern history about this account is the way in which it contrasts sharply with typical Australian, typical British, typical European, typical colonial narratives of the colonial process in that same area. An era, of course. Major Edmund Lockyer's military outpost, later named Fredericktown, for instance, was established on behalf of the then colony of New South Wales, out of fear that French colonial endeavours in the region would spawn, and the very real possibility of them spawning a French colony. Essentially, had the French established a colony in Western Australia, this would have given them claim to, in a European sense of the word, that portion of the continent, and would have created two contemporary Australias, one French and one British. And this narrative, but that aspect of it is essentially left out. It's not important to Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence that European narrative of jostling for power is in it. Rather, the focus is brought back in the novel to the wider Aboriginal community and family units and their impressions and experience of that early colonisation. And that focus for the narrative continues as the narrative of British colonialism kind of develops further and continues into 1829 with the landing of the first, definitive colony by Admiral Sir Charles Howell Fremantle. And this pattern continues into 1900, when Western Australia is described as a prosperous colony. 1907, when we are first introduced to Jigalong, and finally in 1931, when we meet Molly, Daisy, and Gracie. From the perspective of the novel, at each chapter, each new era introduced, the reader is exposed to a rising tide of colonization that isn't discussed in the manner in which a European history would be, in terms of great white men. And we'll talk about that term. I'm doing the inverted comma fingers around my head as I say it. We'll talk about that term, great white men, in a moment. But in terms of great white men and the jostling of power and political entities across the broader spread of British colonialism, this is not a focus for Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence. Rather, in 1826, the novel talks about first experiences of Indigenous peoples with the colony, in the manner we've previously, or just momentarily discussed. In 1829, the novel discusses how the expansion and prosperity of that colony led to the decline of, and indeed it's the title of Chapter 3, The Decline of Aboriginal Society, but how that prosperity of that colony led to dispossession and the decline of an independent society and civilization for the Indigenous peoples of the area, along with the first starts, I guess, to the rise of impoverishment and disadvantage. And indeed, in 1900, the novel talks about how that impoverishment and disadvantage led to violence then. In 1907, the novel talks about government's assistance and paternalistic programs as an expansion of the colony. And indeed, that leads up to the novel's discussion of 1931, when it begins to discuss stolen generation and the forced removal, particularly the forced removal of Molly, Daisy, and Gracie. So in that sense, then, Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence narrativizes a subaltern history of colonization. And we'll talk about narrativizing history in a moment. But it provides a narrativized history, subaltern history, of colonization, assessing and asserting the impact of the colony on broad social groups, peoples, and civilizations it details within the novel. Peoples such as the Budidjara, Mandijara, Guadalajara, and a huge collection of others. And this sort of assessing and asserting of the impact the colony has had on these colonized peoples that it talks about in the novel is then brought to a point. And when I say it's brought to a point, I mean it strips away the abstractness that a history like this can often attain, and it brings it to a very real point where we can say there is a discernible impact when the novel introduces the reader to Molly, Daisy, and Gracie. And in this fashion, the relatively late introduction of the three girls and their family in Chapter 5 is where Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence stops talking about, as I said before. It stops talking about colonization at that point in abstract terms. And where the novel previously described the broad strokes of history taking place across the wide landscape of Western Australia, jumping forward through a century or so in 3 or 4 chapters, the action and impact, though, of that colonization, of Indigenous dispossession, of forced removal, of government paternalism, all those things it describes is given a human face when we meet Molly, Daisy, and Gracie, and when we, the reader, experience their removal and their harrowing journey, their odyssey across the landscape home. And this humanization, this removal of the abstract terms and the historicity terms of it, um, helps the novel to more easily and definitively construct the actions of the British colonial, later Australian governments as criminal. And when I say construct, okay, when I say construct in that sense, that's not to say that the actions of colonization anywhere in the world are in any way, shape, or form appropriate or apt or right, but rather the use of the phrase construct in a literary term acknowledges that history, that every history, not just Doris Pilkington's Follow the Rabbit Friends, but every history ever written and will be written is a form of text, and a text is constructed. Now, on the previous couple of slides, I referred to the idea of traditional history. Specifically, I referred to Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence as, I guess, going against the grain or contrasting sharply with or reacting to what I would call traditional history, or what I did refer to as traditional history. By referring to traditional history, I am talking about the manner in which history has been typically discussed and presented for the last several hundred, or I guess even 1,000 years, going back to the Romans and the Greeks. And that is both as having a scholarly element associated with academic institutions and professional institutions, and a popular one, and the popular one being associated with public and commercial histories, such as those memorialized in cities and also widely available for consumption in a variety of forms, such as DVDs, documentaries, the History Channel, essentially, is a really key example of that popularized traditional history. And while it's no longer the case for academic institutions, this form of history has long been associated with and operated through the lens of the great man theory of history. The great man theory of history is a 19th century conception that argued history can be largely understood through the actions of heroes, which the concept defines as great men. And this is and it is very much intended that these great men are also white, upper class, and European. Described in the doctrines of the theory as persons of charisma, education, wisdom, and political power, who use these skills to have a decisive impact on history, to reshape the world around them, and to shape it into their own image. The great man theory was popularized by Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s and taken quite seriously at that time. Of course, the concept is, these days, heavily ridiculed, and in particular, with the emergence of feminism, postmodernism, postcolonialism, and popular cultural studies, it's generally acknowledged that a history is a constructed text. That is to say, it is written, and written from a perspective. And so that simply writing history as the impact of great men is one such form of writing history. That's one way of constructing history. That's one way of making sense of the past. However, as a means of making sense of the past, of writing history in and of itself, the great man theory has been, since the sort of acknowledgement that history is a constructed text and not an unobjective, unbiased recounting or assessment of the past, since then, the great man theory has been near universally categorized today as sexist, classist, racist, and fundamentally backwards way to examine history. I'll talk more about the backwards in a moment. In this fashion, then, one can quite aptly argue, and it has been aptly argued many, many times, that the great man theory of history is horribly limited. And on the other hand, and here we return to it, that it is a fundamentally backwards manner in which to look at history, suggesting that the concept of that white upper class men of European origin are the makers of the time rather than products of it. And I'll say that again, the great man theory of history is seen as limited, partly because of the vast quantity of events, peoples, cultures, civilizations, and other forms of historical areas of historical examination that it ignores. And it is seen as fundamentally backwards because it positions upper-class white European men as the producers of their times rather than the products of it. And indeed, it's one of the great acknowledgements of history that we are all products of our time. And also, though, that, simply put, the events and the deeds attributed to great white European men are not necessarily their own achievements in and of themselves, but rather things that are also historical circumstances. Take Columbus's route to the Americas, for instance. European exploration from the Vikings to Marco Polo had suggested that a further landmass was reachable across the Atlantic Ocean, towards which Spain was expanding since 1336 with the Canary Islands, as a way to avoid the Islamic-controlled Silk Road. While it may not have been understood that there were a further 2 continents present, indeed it wasn't until sometime after Columbus that became a thing, it was simply a matter of time that those land masses would be contacted or Europeans would arrive at them. And the financial viability, i.e., it was financially sound, of such explorations in that period produced numerous individuals akin to Columbus. Again, however, the great man approach in this sense is to history is seen as something that's quite old hat, and in the academic sector, very, very much out of fashion. Popularly, though, and this is kind of the interesting thing, popularly, it's still much more prevalent. And you see popular documentaries focusing, on individual figures, not necessarily male figures, but individual figures as a way of, making history, easy sense of history rather than talking about the complex and nuanced social circumstances and times that produce both certain types of individuals and certain social phenomena. History becomes much more marketable with that individual focus. But the great man theory of history, as I guess a traditional form of history, is a form of history that in its focus on upper-class European men and their deeds is called to task in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence. And I think the book very much tears up the ideological underpinnings of this form of history by switching the typical associations or the long-standing associations from the individual to the collective, from the colonizer to the colonized. And in this sense, Dorothy Cline offers the argument that the first 4 chapters of Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, that is the one from the founding of the first military outpost through to just prior to introducing the girls, that the first 4 chapters of Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence call upon a contrast familiar in Australian literature. The concept of civilization is contrasted with savagery. Traditionally, however, in Australian and British literature, invasion has been framed as an expanding civilization and expanding into Indigenous Australian spaces that are framed as zones of savagery. However, Klein, as I noted a moment ago, argues that Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence inverts this contrast, creating a narrative of a barbaric England invading the space of civilized Western Australian Aborigines. Herein, the depiction of whites as savage invaders within the novel is reinforced by adjectives such as ruthless, cruel, and murderous in reference to settlers and colonists. In contrast, the Aboriginal people, on the other hand, are later described as brave, gallant, friendly, and hospitable. In this sense, then, we see a clear inversion in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, one that applies the adjectives that indicate barbarism to the colonizer and frames the colonized in terms of the qualities that are commonly assumed to represent European civilization. In that sense, Klein further argues, and I quote, "Overall, the first 4 chapters produce a powerful counter-discursive account of early contact Aboriginal history by invoking the dichotomy of civilized versus uncivilized. The text exposes the cultural bias of such categorizations and the hypocrisy of the colonial project to bring civilization to the primitive peoples." And she has around the world primitive, a set of inverted commas, as you can see there. To continue Klein's quote, this argues for a general rereading of Australian history, in which, for instance, charity and goodwill turn out to be insults. Progress and prosperity are rather regress and deterioration. Contributions to the agricultural industry constitute forms of exploitation, and the removal of children is not a benevolent but a criminal act. The inversion of the colonial binary opposition, the flipping of the categories of colonizer and colonized and their typical associations, is an important theme in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence and is touched on again and again throughout the text. The distinction of Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence from a more, I guess, and I'm doing the inverted commas with my fingers here, traditional form of history is not only in the content of the novel, but also its presentation in the very form of a novel as well. In this sense, then, Pilkington's text constitutes a narrativized history. In terms of definition, a narrativized history can be identified as a history which is told through a story. When we discuss the narrativization of history, we are talking about the manner in which history can be presented, say, as a novel, as a short story, oral story, film, or other form of narrative. Specifically with Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, we are of course discussing a novel. This form of written history is explored by scholars such as Frederick Jameson, and described by Jameson as both a contradiction of the traditional, and again doing the inverted commas fingers, traditional form, and an anchoring of history simultaneously. The traditional form of history writing strove to explain how the world came to be what it was, and was written by and for upper-class white European men, again, the great man theory of history. And thus, more traditional recordings of history in the European sense of the world have minimalized or ignored contributions to anyone who did not fit that category. At the same time, however, the narrativized history helps become anchored for the audience in terms of both its marketplace and the act of reading. Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, for instance, is a history of the colonisation of Western Australia by the British government and its impact on the Aboriginal population of that state. At the same time, the book is also a novel of the harrowing removal from their home and journey back to it undertaken by Molly, Daisy and Gracie. As a form of history then, Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence is one that Jamieson argues as a format is more natural to the human mind. And that when we tell stories and recount our past, say the events of the day, we do so in the form of a story or a manner that so it makes sense, or a narrative manner so that it makes sense. And within that mode, the kind of questions of accuracy and importance that traditional forms of history encounter do not apply. What I mean by accuracy and importance is that traditional history was combined with chronology, a recounting of events in order, essentially names, dates, and key moments. And in doing so, it was expected to deliver a holistic and accurate account of important events of the past. And that meant the exclusion, that there was exclusionary to anything deemed unimportant, i.e. anything that didn't fit into a great man history, and dry, largely in delivery, containing little detail but containing great deal of detail but little character. For all its non-traditionality, I think that's a wonderful thing in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, because this narrativized history doesn't really, I guess, encounter or endear questions of accuracy, but rather highlights within itself an emphasis of character. What is included, what is left out, what is highlighted, indicate the character and nature of the history and its subject matter in the same manner as what an individual does or doesn't recount about their day informs the audience what kind of person they are. For example, I'm an avid comic book collector. When I watch The Big Bang Theory, I notice what comics they are reading. And when I explain the episode in which Leonard cheated on his girlfriend over an issue of Hellboy, that factor comes through. In that sense, we have something similar with Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence. And when I say something similar, I'm talking about the manner in which Pilkington's novel highlights the Indigenous experience of colonisation. It doesn't worry about the jostling between European powers and European colonies. It zeroes in on the impact of colonisation and of British colonisation for the Aboriginal peoples of Western Australia, and then stresses the humanism of this moment, the human impact of that colonial process. In that sense, Grant Rodwell argues that at base, in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, there is at play, and I quote, a larger vision of the relationship between the individual and the historical. Not just of the manner in which the individual lives are shaped by history, but of the way history is too often eludes the truth of the story it tells, failing to discern the accreditation of memory, loss, and love that shape our lives and bind us to each other. In general, then, Rodwell further argues that the historical novel or narrativized history has an enormous advantage over the formalized academic history texts, such as the textbook. Rodwell bases this argument on the manner in which a novel evokes a sense of embodiment of the time and its inhabitants in a manner in which the formal history, with its strict evocation of evidence, does not. The engagement of historical materials throughout Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence essentially referring to the manner in which it crafts and establishes its depiction of the past, is quite interesting for its use of documents intermingled with the narrative, such as the telegram on page 51, where a traditional, where an academic history, where a non-narrativized history would exclusively use these documents as a basis, as its assertion of evidence. And they say a narrativized history, or rather a historical fiction, might not necessarily rely so stringently or be so forward with its sources. Pilkington's novel does both. It combines the academic requirement of source material and evidence with the narrativist's art. And indeed, you see not just on page 51, but throughout the novel, a variety of different documents presented. And indeed, 10 pages later, page 61, you have the letter from Constable Riggs to the Chief Protector of Aborigines. So, in that sense then, of the novel's engagement with historical materials, Anne Brewster argues that Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence opens up cutting ironies. An article that appeared in the Western Australian in 1931 casts the girls as vulnerable and disabled temporarily by fright. At Moore River Mission, they were very timid and scared by their new quarters. The Western Australian Protector is quoted as saying, "We are very anxious that no harm may come to them in the bush." Another police inspector reports that he feared for their safety. Pilkington underscores this irony by describing the girls' constant vigilance and stealth on their long trek, their awareness at every stage that they were not safe from the authorities, spelling out that it was the vast apparatus mobilized for their protection that terrorized them, which they were fleeing. For indeed, this is a story about escape, about resilience in the face of prodigious effort to surveil, monitor, track, and incarcerate Indigenous people. The success of three young girls in evading the monstrous machinery of surveillance in a program of eugenics-driven genocide and finding their way back to their own home takes on epic proportions. This alternative history of Aboriginal resistance is a history of heroism, triumph, and survival against all odds. Pilkington explicitly endows this story of her mother and aunts with the status of history. In the first line of the narrative, she describes it as a historical event, and later of one of the longest walks in the history of the outback. These statements definitively rewrite a national history which has to date given European explorers the monopoly on long heroic treks. At the same time, however, the novel also becomes a space where European and Aboriginal forms of history intersect. While Pilkington certainly engaged written histories and archival material in writing the novel, there's also present in the book, within the book, forms of history Brewster describes as having a counter-archive effect, based largely on oral accounts from her family. These include Aboriginal knowledges and practices such as hunting, health practice, spirituality, food, drinks and other crafts, marriage, practices and beliefs. The novel also provides a lineage and chronology of descent for the family. And in that way, the two forms of history within the novel impact on one another, contrasting and hybridizing the experience of the reader. And in this sense, Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, while does not present a total view of the time periods referred to in the same way as we might expect, say, a textbook of Western Australian history to do so, but rather it demonstrates to the audience that here lies, to quote, right here, lies the impact of colonization on these three girls. And in that sense, Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence is both a subaltern history in narrative form and a counter-archival story, blending elements that are traditionally excluded from the historical record. And because of the manner in which Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence presents the history of colonization as a narrative with mixed forms of evidence and support throughout Pilkington's work, there are connections here to broader Indigenous histories throughout Australia. The book becomes, and part of the reason why it's so powerful, a keystone exposition of colonization and its impact, one that is tied to other events that surround not so much those depicted in the novel itself, but Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence's contemporary time and space. I'm thinking here, of course, about the Bring Them Home report, which concluded that forced removal, the stolen generations, saw that, and I quote from the report itself here, Indigenous families and communities have endured gross violations of their human rights. These violations continue to affect Indigenous people's daily lives. They were an act of genocide aimed at wiping out Indigenous families, communities, and cultures, vital to the precious and inalienable heritage of Australia. Of the link between the report and Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, Damien Shaw writes, and I quote, "In 1996, Doris Pilkington wrote the now famous book Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, about the living conditions in children's institutions, describing them as more like a concentration camp than a residential school for Aboriginal children. And yet it wasn't until 1997 that the silence was truly broken with the publication of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission's report, Bring Them Home, National Inquiry into the Separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, generally knowing them as Bring Them Home, BTH. BTH contained harrowing evidence, finding that forced removal of Indigenous children was a gross violation of human rights and continued well after Australia had undertaken international human rights commitments. In particular, the report concluded that the removal constituted an act of genocide contrary to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Persecution of the Crime of Genocide, which forbids forcibly transferring children of a group to another group, with the intention of destroying the group. It was racially discriminatory because it only applied to Aboriginal children on that scale. The report linked the finding of genocide to the question of an apology, both were discussed in the context of reparations. Inquiry recommended monetary compensation among other steps, rather more concrete than saying sorry or pledging never again. So again, with Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, to round out Short's commentary back to the novel. The novel, again, outlines in concrete terms the impact of colonization on the Aboriginal population, talking about both the general history of it and leading up to a decisive example of personal impact in the form of Molly, Daisy and Gracie. And I think that not only does Pilkington's novel demand and ask for we'll stick with demand, a concrete response to that history of colonization, but it also implies broadly that the entire history of the entire expansion of England into Aboriginal space and the continuum of colonial apparatuses and mechanisms of racism by the Commonwealth of Australia demands a concrete response, and indeed requires one. So in regard to events such as Kevin Rudd's apology 2008, as a form of concrete response to that history and to the kind of events detailed in Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, I wonder if that is A, both a concrete response, and B, an apt and appropriate response. One that actually kind of, I guess, answers the questions that still linger there. I'm not really sure, to be honest. I don't have a conclusion to that one, but if you guys want to carry that on into journals and on Moodle, something I haven't actually suggested for a while, please do. Yeah, please do. So in week 2, I've got week 1 there on the slide, but it's meant to be week 2. I guess our first week of content, we looked at the film for Rabbit-Proof Fence. This week we're looking at the novel, Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence, on which the film was based. Now, the novel is broadly a history of British colonisation of Western Australia from an Indigenous perspective. And indeed, the impact of that colonisation is central to the book and very much brought home with the removal and then journey home of Molly, Gracie, and Daisy. The fact that it highlights the decisive impact of colonisation in both collectivist at the start and then personal terms, in terms of the 3 girls, is indeed one of the most powerful pieces, aspects of this novel. As a novel, though, it is a narrativized history. It tells you the history, or it writes the history, delivers it to the reader in the form of a story. And it's very much one that contrasts with traditional, inverted comma fingers again, traditional European, with great man theories of history. Both because it's a subaltern history, i.e. a view from the colonized viewpoint, and B, because of the format in which it occupies. And in this form, I think it's a very powerful inversion of the themes and forms of the colonial paradigm. It switches the association of European colonization and goodness, or benevolence, and kind of really much exposes the colonial process for what it is. Right. And we might leave it there this week. As always, I've got some further reading for you. I've got Brewster's there, who I notice I've formatted wrong with an extra dot point somehow appearing in the middle of Brewster's citation. I've got Dorothy Klein there with narrating a different his story. And of course, I've got Damien Short. Basically, the 3 articles from which I drew larger quotations this week. Now, as always, I want to remind everybody that we have our live discussions at 10 a.m. on Thursday. It would be great if, for those of you who haven't been along this semester yet to a live discussion, to jump on and participate. Of course, being Skype, it is video chat, and I'd love to be able to put some of the names to faces that I've been both reading Moodle comments from and marking work for, and seeing just pop up in emails and the participants section of Moodle. So it'd be great to actually kind of just for maybe one of the last weeks put some names to faces. We also have, of course, ongoing our Moodle discussions, and I noticed the discussion has been picking up a little bit towards the end, which is fantastic. and great to see that you guys have been taking it all in and then, I guess, putting it back out there for your classmates to see and share. Remember, though, that these are the last couple of weeks of the semester and of the course, after which we'll be into swap back and then exams. So these are really, I guess, the last weeks to ask questions, discuss content, or raise any issues you might be having in a definitive manner. We are nearly at the terminus, and yeah, while of course I'll be available via email and phone conversation after that point, I obviously, for obvious reasons, throughout SWATVAC and after the exams, I won't be checking Moodle quite as regularly. And indeed, we won't be having live discussions after next week. So, this is kind of if you've got questions that have been rummaging around the old noggin for a while, now's the time to, I guess, if you've got them, ask them. Don't smoke them. You can't smoke ideas, even though that's the traditional form of the saying. We also have our final assessments coming up. Essay 2 is being marked this week. I say at the moment, obviously I'm not marking it right now because, well, I'm recording the lecture, and that would be an amazing feat of mental ability to be able to both mark effectively and deliver the lecture in any form other than incoherent dribble. So SA2 is being marked this week, and it should be returned to you early next week. Assignment 3 is, of course, our journal, and that is due next week on the 28th of October. This is, of course, the reflective forms of writing you've been doing throughout the semester. Again, it's a reflective task, so it doesn't have to actually kind of be based on an essay or argumentative format. It's rather, it really is your thoughts, and you can just kind of have a bit of an explore of the different ideas instead of trying to make an argument or point. It's still got to adhere to kind of academic standards in terms of plagiarism and referencing, i.e. if you quote someone, put in the reference. If you're having any troubles with your journal task, if you need an extension, etc., 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 the usual kind of spiel that I've been giving all semester for assessments. In regard to any of that, just please let me know. As always, I'm very open to granting extensions. We expect you to be able to manage your own time, and part of that is saying that I need a little bit more time on this. Secondly, there is, of course, the exam coming up. I'll probably talk a bit more extensively about the exam in the final lecture, i.e. next week's lecture, but it is open book. Now, have a look again at previous year's exams to get an idea of the format of the exam. Remember that the content, though, is going to be based on this year's course exclusively. So while next year's course, oh shit, I've done it again. While last year's exams are based on the content of last year's courses, this year's is based exclusively on this year's content. So in that sense, the thing to do to really prepare is to just try writing short answers or short summaries of various ideas and texts in this year's course. And when I say ideas and text, you will need, the exam questions themselves will be based on the text, but you will need knowledge of the various theories and forms we've discussed to be able to answer them in an effective and decisive manner. So go back over the old lectures, go back through the old recordings, reread Shoemaker a few times, look up people like Fanon and Said, and David Uniapon and Russell Ward and other individuals that I've mentioned throughout the year. Look at the additional readings. Look at the further readings in the back of the lecture slides, and just stay appraised with the knowledge and get really good over SWATVAC at writing short summaries of all those things. When I say SWAT vac, I guess for Monash students, I don't know if you guys call it SWAT vac. It's the sort of few weeks before exams start, in which you have to prepare your exams, and there's no classes on and whatnot. All right, so we're going to leave it there. As always, I'm available by phone, email, Moodle discussion, and live discussion on Skype. So yeah, I will chat to you guys next week for our last lecture. Wow. Yeah, I'll catch you guys next week for the last lecture. See ya.